My son-in-law once sent me a message that froze my blood. He wrote, "Let me know when the will reading is. I just want my millions." While my daughter was lying in a hospital bed only 3 rooms away, fighting for her life, I stared at those words until they blurred through my tears. That single text shattered everything I thought I knew about my family, about loyalty, and about love. For 7 long years I had called that man my son. I had watched him hold my daughter's hand at the altar, had opened my home to him, had welcomed him into our lives as family. And yet, with one heartless message, he revealed exactly what kind of monster he truly was. If you're watching this, make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're tuning in from. But first, let me go back to where it all began. Because this story started 3 weeks earlier, back when I still believed I was simply a grieving mother-in-law, not the next name on a carefully planned list of victims. It was a Tuesday morning when Dr. Morales first used the word terminal in reference to my daughter Emily's cancer. I remember that moment vividly because I was holding her hand when he said it, and I felt her fingers go still inside mine. Emily was 43 years old, a mother of 2 young boys, and suddenly the doctor was talking about months instead of years. He spoke gently, with the kind of practiced compassion I'd learned to recognize during my own 38 years as a nurse. But even his kindness couldn't soften the truth. I could see the finality in his eyes, that quiet look professionals get when they're preparing families for goodbye rather than hope. To her credit, Emily handled the news better than I did. She asked questions, calm, direct ones, about treatments, timelines, and what would happen to her children. Meanwhile, I sat there silently mourning everything we would lose. No more Christmas mornings watching her boys tear open their presents while she beamed with pride. No more long Sunday calls that stretched lazily into the evening. No more pretending to enjoy her dreadful cooking simply because she tried so hard to make something special for us. Then her husband, Daniel, entered the room. He didn't glance at his wife or acknowledge the devastation written across her face. His attention stayed fixed on the phone in his hand. "How long is this going to take?" he asked flatly, standing by the door. "I've got a conference call with investors at 2. Dr. Morales went over the diagnosis again, repeating details while Daniel scrolled through his emails, barely listening. When the doctor finished, Daniel finally looked up and asked, "So, what's the timeline here? I need to know for planning purposes." Planning purposes. The words felt like poison. He spoke as if scheduling a renovation, not as if his wife had just been handed a death sentence. But Emily, ever the peacekeeper, squeezed my hand and said softly, "Daniel has been working so hard on his new business venture. I don't want my illness to derail his success." Even then, knowing what I know now, I tried to convince myself that maybe I was judging him too harshly. Perhaps people process grief in different ways. Maybe his coldness was shock disguised as practicality. That fragile hope died quickly. The moment we left the hospital, Daniel pulled out his phone and began making calls about repositioning assets and adjusting timelines. Something cold took root in my stomach. That night, instead of cooking for Emily as he usually did, he ordered Chinese takeout, claiming he was too stressed to focus on meal prep. When I offered to make her favorite soup, he waved me away. "We're trying to maintain normalcy here, Mom," he said. "Emily doesn't need to be treated like an invalid yet." Yet, the word lingered like a storm cloud. It sounded as though he were already counting down the days until she would become one. The following 3 weeks dissolved into a blur of medical appointments, insurance forms, and quiet heartbreak. My daughter worked hard to keep some semblance of normal life for her boys, while Daniel grew more detached by the day. He began working late every night, claiming the new company demanded his full attention. He'd stumble home long after midnight, grab a beer, and spend hours on his laptop doing what he called essential planning. When I gently suggested that he might want to spend more time with his wife while he still could, he gave me a look of cold condescension. "Linda," he said, "someone has to handle the practical matters. Emily's medical expenses are going to be enormous. The boys' college funds can't just vanish because we're being emotional instead of strategic." Strategic. That was his favorite word in those days. Strategic planning. Strategic positioning. Strategic thinking. Never once did I hear words like love, sorrow, or memory. He never spoke about holding her, cherishing her, or preparing to live without her. Then came the phone calls. Whispered conversations that fell silent the moment I entered a room. Snippets about timeline acceleration and moving up the schedule. When I asked Emily about it, she smiled faintly and said Daniel was simply trying to secure their financial future before the bills overwhelmed them. "He's being so responsible, Mom," she assured me one afternoon while he was supposedly in another investor meeting. "I know he seems distant, but he's just taking care of everything so I don't have to worry." I wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her. Tell her that responsible husbands don't discuss schedules and asset repositioning when their wives are dying. Responsible husbands hold hands, cry together, and build bucket lists to make every moment count. But Emily had always seen the best in people, even when it blinded her to their faults. The first time my fear became something darker was the day I overheard him on the phone with someone named Gavin. I had stopped by unannounced, bringing Emily's favorite magazines, and let myself in with the spare key she'd given me years ago. Daniel was in his home office, the door slightly ajar, his voice low and urgent. "No, we can't wait that long," he said. "The window is narrowing faster than expected. We need to move to phase 2 by next week at the latest." Phase 2. The phrase hit me like a hammer. I froze in the hallway, clutching the magazines to my chest as I listened. His tone wasn't that of a businessman, it was something colder, more precise. "The documentation is already in place," Daniel continued. Daniel said, "Once the main obstacle is removed, everything else should proceed smoothly." I didn't even need to hear the rest. But he kept talking, his voice calm, professional, almost cheerful. "The beneficiary changes were processed last month, and the insurance company confirmed the policy is fully active." Beneficiary changes. Insurance policies. Main obstacle removed. Each phrase echoed in my mind, clicking together like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. The main obstacle wasn't a rival businessman or a financial challenge. The main obstacle was my daughter. I stepped back from the door, trembling, clutching the magazines tighter as my mind raced. 20 minutes later, Emily came down the stairs, pale, fragile, but still beautiful, still trusting. I wanted to tell her everything I'd overheard, but how could I? How could I look my dying daughter in the eyes and tell her that her husband might be planning to help her along to the grave? So instead I smiled, handed her the magazines, told her how much I loved her, while every instinct screamed for me to speak the truth. That silence became my first mistake, though it would not be my last. Emily passed away on a Thursday morning in March. Her boys were on either side of her, holding her hands while I sat beside her, stroking her hair and whispering that it was okay to rest. Daniel stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, making what he insisted was an urgent business call. Even in her final breaths, he couldn't be fully present. When the heart monitor went flat, and the nurses came in with the gentle professionalism of people who have seen death far too many times, Daniel finally hung up his phone. He approached the bed wearing what could only be described as rehearsed sorrow. "I'm so sorry for your loss," the doctor told us softly, his eyes flicking between me and Daniel. But my son-in-law was already checking his watch. "What happens next?" he asked. "In terms of procedures, timeline for arrangements, that sort of thing?" The doctor hesitated, visibly unsettled by the detached tone, but explained about death certificates, paperwork, and notifying the funeral home. Daniel nodded as if he were taking notes for a corporate meeting. Meanwhile, I sat frozen, trying to absorb the reality that my daughter was gone, and her husband was treating her death like an item on a checklist. The boys, 13 and 11, were devastated, though somehow coping better than their father was pretending to. Lucas, my eldest grandson, kept asking when his dad would stop taking phone calls long enough to help plan the funeral. Evan, my youngest and most sensitive, simply stared at Daniel with wide, confused eyes. "Dad seems happy," he whispered to me one afternoon while Daniel was pacing in the hallway, supposedly handling urgent matters. "Is that normal when somebody dies?" I wanted to tell him the truth, that no, it was not normal, but I couldn't plant suspicion in an 11-year-old's grieving heart. So I just pulled him close, kissed his forehead, and promised that we would get through this together. Even as I said it, I knew Daniel no longer belonged in that promise. The funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Daniel insisted on managing everything himself, saying he wanted to spare the rest of us from the burden of decisions. When I offered to help with flowers, music, or even printing the programs, he gave me a patronizing smile. "I've got everything under control, Mom," he said gently, using that condescending tone people reserve for the elderly or incompetent. "The best thing you can do is focus on supporting the boys through this difficult transition." Transition. Even grief sounded like corporate jargon when it came out of his mouth. But the moment that truly sealed my suspicion came when we discussed the guest list. I expected we'd invite Emily's college friends, her book club members, the neighbors who'd become like family. Instead, Daniel handed me a list full of names I didn't recognize: investors, business partners, and corporate acquaintances. "These people were very important to Emily," he said coolly. "They were part of who she really was in her final years." I frowned. "What about Rachel and Claire from her book club? They've been calling every day asking about the arrangements." Daniel waved dismissively. "Emily outgrew those relationships. She told me they bored her. This service needs to reflect who she truly was at the end, not who she used to be." I stared at him in disbelief. Just a week before she died, Emily had been laughing about Rachel's obsession with romance novels and Claire's endless recommendations of Russian literature. They'd even planned to read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo after her next round of treatment. "I think you're mistaken about her feelings toward them," I said gently, choosing my words with care. His smile vanished. "I think I knew my wife better than anyone, Linda," he said, his voice tight with irritation. "I understand this is hard for you, but I need you to trust my judgment about what Emily would have wanted." What Emily would have wanted. The phrase hung in the air, heavy and final. He said it with the easy confidence of a man who had already rewritten history to fit his narrative. And before I could respond, his phone buzzed. I watched his face light up. A genuine smile, the kind I hadn't seen since before Emily's diagnosis. He turned the screen away quickly, but not before I caught a flash of a woman's name followed by a heart emoji. A heart emoji. 3 days after his wife's death. That was the moment every suspicion hardened into certainty. Daniel wasn't just cold, he was hiding something far darker. The funeral was set for 10 o'clock Tuesday morning. By 9:30, I was seated in the front pew of St. Mary's Catholic Church, the same place where Daniel and Emily had exchanged vows 7 years earlier. The boys sat beside me in their little black suits, Lucas trying to be brave, Evan clutching the framed photo of his mother. At 9:45, there was still no sign of Daniel. "Where's Dad?" Lucas asked, his voice breaking. "He's supposed to speak first." I checked my phone, no messages, no missed calls. I had tried reaching him twice that morning, but both calls had gone straight to voicemail. "I'm sure he's just running a little late," I told the boys, forcing a calm smile while my stomach churned with dread. Deep down, I already knew something was terribly wrong. At precisely 9:58, Father Donnelly approached our pew, his expression marked with quiet concern. "Mrs. Graves," he said softly, "we really need to begin. Do you know where Daniel is?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed in my lap. My hands trembled as I unlocked the screen, expecting some reasonable excuse: traffic, car trouble, an emergency at home. But what appeared on the screen were 7 words that made my stomach twist into knots. Family emergency. Start service without me. Sorry. A family emergency. On the day his wife was being buried, Daniel was somewhere else, too preoccupied to say goodbye. I showed the message to Father Donnelly. He blinked in disbelief but quickly regained his composure, lowering his voice. "Well," he said gently, "I suppose we'll need to adjust the program slightly." Adjust the program. As though the widower's absence at his wife's funeral was nothing more than a minor scheduling inconvenience. The service began without him. I gave the eulogy I had written as a backup, my voice shaking only once, when I spoke of the way Emily used to laugh so hard that tears ran down her cheeks. Her sister, who had flown in from Denver, shared stories of their childhood, painting vivid memories of summer afternoons and whispered secrets. The boys sat beside me holding hands. Lucas tried to stay strong for his little brother, but I could see the storm building behind his eyes. Evan stared toward the empty front row seat that should have been occupied by his father. Each passing minute without Daniel deepened the silence in that sacred space. After the service, we stood outside the church accepting condolences. The spring air felt too bright, too alive for a day like this. I was trying to find words that might explain Daniel's absence. Something that didn't sound as horrifyingly wrong as it was, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Mrs. Graves?" a man's voice asked. It was calm, official. "My name is Detective Alvarez with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about Daniel Graves. Are you his mother-in-law?" My blood turned to ice. "Yes," I said quickly. "What's happened? Is he hurt?" "No, ma'am. He's not injured. But we wanted to inform you that we currently have him, and a woman named Vanessa Cole, in custody following a domestic disturbance at a hotel about 30 miles outside town. They were both intoxicated and involved in an altercation that caused property damage." I stood there in my black funeral dress, surrounded by flowers and sympathy cards, listening to a police officer explain that my son-in-law had been arrested in a hotel room with another woman, on the very day of his wife's funeral. "Ma'am, are you still there?" "Yes," I managed to whisper. "He's asked us to contact you regarding bail arrangements," the detective continued. "His regular attorney appears to be unavailable." Bail arrangements. While Emily's body was being lowered into the ground, Daniel was sitting in a holding cell, asking me for money so he could return to his affair. "Tell Mr. Graves," I said steadily, "that he can call someone else for help. I'm at his wife's funeral." That night, after the boys had finally cried themselves to sleep, Daniel appeared at my doorstep. His shirt was wrinkled, his face unshaven, and he reeked of cheap cologne mixed with stale sweat and desperation. Through the window, I watched him pace my porch, glancing at his phone as though rehearsing another excuse. He ran a hand through his greasy hair before finally pressing the doorbell. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Petty, perhaps. But after watching my grandsons sob for hours because their father had abandoned them on the worst day of their lives, I thought a few extra seconds of waiting might do him good. "Linda," he began, his voice carrying that smooth, practiced tone he used whenever he wanted to manipulate sympathy. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked flatly, not stepping aside to let him in. "I assumed you'd still be dealing with your family emergency." A flush crept up his neck, but he kept his composure. "Look, I know how this looks, but you don't understand the whole situation. Vanessa and I were business partners. She's been helping me manage some complex financial matters related to Emily's estate. Yesterday was supposed to be a quick meeting to finalize urgent paperwork before the banks opened this morning. Business partners. Estate management. Urgent paperwork." Even his lies were coded in corporate language. "And this urgent paperwork required you to be drunk at a hotel 30 miles away," I said evenly. "During your wife's funeral?" He straightened up, his tone defensive but oddly confident. "We were celebrating, Linda. We closed a major deal that will secure the boys' college funds. Emily would have wanted me to focus on their financial stability, even if it meant missing some of the ceremonial aspects of the day." Ceremonial aspects? That's what he called his wife's funeral. I studied him closely. This man I had once trusted with my daughter's happiness. He looked smaller now. Not physically, but in the way people diminish when the mask finally slips. "Where are the boys?" I asked quietly. "They're fine," he said. "They're staying with Vanessa for a couple of days while I sort out some business matters. She's great with kids." I thought a change of scenery might help after yesterday's difficult events. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The boys, my grieving grandsons, were staying with the same woman Daniel had been arrested with at a hotel. The same woman he was calling a business partner. "I want to see them," I said sharply. "That's actually part of what I wanted to discuss," Daniel replied, his expression tightening. "I've been thinking about what's best for Lucas and Evan during this transition period. Too much contact with Emily's side of the family might make it harder for them to adjust to their new normal." New normal. Transition period. He sounded like he was giving a quarterly report, not talking about 2 children who had just lost their mother. "What exactly are you saying, Daniel?" I asked, my voice low. He folded his arms and gave a condescending sigh. "I'm saying that maybe it would be best if you took some time to process your grief before resuming your relationship with the boys. They need stability, not guilt, not confusion about my choices. They need to move forward, and I can't do that if you're undermining me." Each word hit like a blow. He was cutting me out, rewriting reality once again. this time to isolate my grandsons completely. And standing in my doorway, watching the man who had once promised to love my daughter forever, I finally understood that he hadn't just destroyed her. He was still destroying everything she had loved. A chill like metal settled deep in my chest as I stared at Daniel across the threshold. "You're cutting me off from my grandsons," I said, my voice barely steady. "I'm protecting them from additional emotional turmoil during an already difficult time," he replied smoothly, as though his choice of words somehow changed what he was doing. "Once things stabilize and they've had time to adjust, we can certainly discuss rebuilding family connections." Rebuilding family connections. He spoke about my bond with my own grandsons as if it were a fractured business partnership, something that might be worth renegotiating later if the conditions improved. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about grief or healing or the boys' well-being. This was about control, about ensuring that I couldn't interfere with whatever Daniel had planned next. All those whispered phone calls, the strategic timelines, the talk about removing obstacles. It all began to make perfect, terrifying sense. "Get off my property," I said quietly. "Linda," he began, lowering his voice in that condescending managerial tone he always used when trying to sound reasonable. "I understand you're upset, but—" "Get off my property," I repeated, sharper now. "Before I call the police and tell them I have concerns about a man who missed his wife's funeral to get drunk with his girlfriend and is now refusing to let her mother see the children." For the first time, his composure cracked. The mask slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. His voice hardened. "You don't want to make this adversarial, Linda. You really don't." But I was already closing the door, heart pounding, mind racing. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, the same one I'd use for grocery lists and reminders, now filled with something far heavier. I wrote down everything I could remember, every strange phone call, every late-night conversation, every mention of timelines and beneficiary changes. I listed the odd behavior surrounding Emily's diagnosis and the way Daniel had controlled every detail of her funeral. By morning, 3 full pages stared back at me, each one another brick in the wall of certainty that had been building inside me. My daughter hadn't just died of cancer. She had been helped along by a husband in a hurry to cash in on her life insurance policy and start over with Vanessa Cole. But conviction and proof are not the same. And if I wanted justice for Emily, and protection for her boys, I needed evidence. That's how I found myself sitting in the parking lot of Maplewood Elementary at 7:30 the next morning, clutching a thermos of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. I knew Daniel's habits too well. Every Wednesday, he dropped the boys off early before his weekly breakfast meeting with investors. If he was still keeping that routine, I might have one chance to see them. At 7:45, Daniel's silver BMW pulled into the drop-off lane. My heart ached as I watched Lucas and Evan climb out of the back seat, dressed neatly for school but looking pale and hollow-eyed. He didn't even bother to step out of the car. The moment their feet touched the pavement, he drove off, leaving them to face their first day back at school after their mother's funeral alone. I waited until his car disappeared around the corner, then stepped out of mine and walked toward the boys. Evan saw me first. He froze, then broke into a run, throwing his arms around my waist in a hug so desperate it almost knocked the breath out of me. "Grandma, where have you been?" he blurted out between sniffles. "Dad said you needed time to feel better about Mom dying, but I wanted to see you yesterday. He said maybe next week, but I missed you." "Slow down, sweetheart," I whispered, stroking his hair, trying to steady my voice. "I missed you too, both of you." Lucas approached more cautiously, his 13-year-old skepticism starting to show. "Dad said you were having a hard time and needed space," he said carefully. "But you seem fine to me." Smart boy. Too smart for his father's manipulation. "I'm fine," I said softly. "And I would never need space from you too. Not ever." "Then why didn't you come see us?" Evan asked, his small voice trembling. "We stayed at Vanessa's house. She has a big TV and made pancakes, but they weren't like Mom's. I wanted to call you, but Dad said not to bother you." Vanessa's house. Not just staying there, they were living there. Being fed, watched, and comforted by the same woman their father had been arrested with. Daniel wasn't wasting time. He was already rebuilding his new family, and writing me out of their lives completely. I crouched down to meet their eyes. Listen to me carefully, I said, my voice low but firm. No matter what anyone tells you, I will always be here for you. Always. If you ever need me, or if anything ever feels wrong, you can call me anytime, day or night. I reached into my purse and pulled out 2 small cards, handing one to each of them. I wrote my number here. Keep it somewhere safe where only you know about it. Can you do that for me? They both nodded, their faces solemn. And if anyone ever says you shouldn't call me, or that I don't want to see you, that person is lying. Do you understand? Yes, Grandma, Evan whispered. Promise me you'll remember that. We promise, Lucas said firmly, and I could see the realization dawning in his eyes. He was starting to see through his father's story. I hugged them tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of their shampoo, memorizing the feel of their arms around me. When they finally turned and walked toward the school doors, something inside me hardened. I was done being the silent, grieving mother-in-law who hoped for decency from indecent people. From that moment forward, I would not sit back and wait for justice. I would create it. It was time to stop mourning and start fighting. The days of sitting in silence hoping for decency were over. If I was going to protect my grandsons and bring justice for my daughter, I needed evidence, undeniable concrete proof of what kind of man Daniel Graves really was. I took out my phone and dialed a number I'd saved the night before. Monahan Private Investigations, a steady female voice answered. How can we help you? I need to hire someone to investigate my son-in-law, I said. I believe he may have murdered my daughter. Claire Monahan looked exactly how I imagined an investigator of her kind would. Sharp-eyed, calm, no nonsense. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her handshake was firm, the kind that said she'd met every kind of liar imaginable and wasn't impressed by any of them. Mrs. Graves, she said, taking a seat across from me at my kitchen table. She opened a folder and set a small digital recorder beside it. Tell me why you think your son-in-law killed your daughter. So I did. For over an hour I told her everything, the whispered phone calls about removing obstacles, the insurance beneficiary changes, his absence at the funeral, the sudden appearance of Vanessa Cole, and the way Daniel had begun cutting me off from my grandsons while positioning Vanessa as their new mother. Claire took notes methodically, interrupting only to confirm dates and names. When I finally finished, she sat back and regarded me with a mix of caution and interest. How much do you know about your daughter's insurance policies? She asked. I know she had life insurance through Daniel's company, I said. Something substantial, though she never mentioned the amount. And you said you overheard him mention beneficiary changes? Yes. That phone call with his associate Gavin. He said they'd been processed last month, so probably January, when Emily was still undergoing treatment. Claire made another note, her pen scratching quietly. Did your daughter ever mention feeling worse after taking her medications? Anything unusual or inconsistent with her diagnosis? The question hit like a thunderclap. I froze thinking back. Actually, yes, I said slowly. In February, she started suffering from severe nausea and dizziness that her oncologist said wasn't typical for her stage. They ran tests, but everything came back normal. Daniel was managing her medications himself, insisting it was too important to risk mistakes. The memory of him carrying that little tray with her pills, every morning and night, suddenly twisted into something far more sinister. Claire nodded grimly. Mrs. Graves, I'll need a few days to confirm some details. But if your suspicions are right, you're now a threat to Daniel's new life with Ms. Cole. Be careful. Don't confront him directly, and don't let him know you've hired anyone. Just live your life as usual and let me handle the investigation. She handed me her card before leaving. The name, Claire Monahan, private investigator, suddenly felt like my only lifeline. That evening I sat alone at my kitchen table, replaying every moment of Emily's illness. The unexplained symptoms. Daniel's obsessive control over her medication. His calm detachment as her health spiraled. Then my phone rang. Unknown number again, but somehow I knew who it might be. Mrs. Graves, a woman's voice said. This is Dr. Naomi Patel from the County Medical Examiner's office. We received an anonymous tip suggesting we take another look at your daughter's case. My pulse quickened. What kind of tip? Someone called our office this afternoon. Dear Patel explained, claiming your daughter's death might not have been entirely natural. They specifically suggested we test for compounds that wouldn't appear on standard toxicology panels. Anonymous tip. Claire was already working. What happens next? I asked. With the family's permission, we can perform additional tests on preserved tissue samples, she said. The process takes about a week, but it will confirm whether foreign substances contributed to your daughter's death. I thought of my grandsons living under the same roof as a man who might have murdered their mother. Of Vanessa Cole. Smiling, cooking, pretending to care for children whose father she may have conspired with. You have my permission, I said firmly. Test for everything. 3 days later Claire called. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the weight of what she was about to say. The medical examiner found traces of oleander extract in your daughter's preserved tissue samples, she said. It's a plant-based toxin that imitates cancer symptoms while accelerating organ failure. Administered in small doses over time, it would be nearly impossible to detect, and it explains the rapid decline in her condition. Oleander. The name alone sent a chill through me. Daniel had been proud of those oleander bushes lining their backyard fence, bragging that they made the property look elegantly maintained. Emily had once worried about them being poisonous, especially with the boys playing nearby, but Daniel had laughed it off, assuring her they were harmless as long as nobody ate them. No one except his wife, apparently. There's more, Claire continued. I've been digging into Daniel's finances and his connection to Vanessa Cole. Your daughter's life insurance was not modest. It was $2 million. And Vanessa isn't just a girlfriend. She's a licensed insurance claims adjuster who's handled all of Daniel's policies for the last 3 years. The pieces fell together with horrifying precision. They've been planning this for a while, Claire said. I found documentation showing Vanessa visited Emily's doctor's offices as Daniel's representative, asking about treatment plans, prognosis, expected timelines. They were coordinating her death to look natural. I sat there, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My daughter had been murdered, slowly, methodically, by her husband and his accomplice. They had poisoned her, exploited her illness, collected her insurance payout, and taken her children as part of their reward. My voice came out barely a whisper. What about the boys? That's what worries me most, Claire said. If Daniel and Vanessa were willing to kill for $2 million, they might see Lucas and Evan as either obstacles or opportunities. The boys are the primary beneficiaries of Emily's estate until they turn 18. Her words struck me harder than any blow. Daniel had already proven he'd kill for money. And now, my grandsons were the only things standing between him and total control of their inheritance. If anything happened to the boys, everything Emily had left behind, their home, her savings, the entire estate, would automatically revert to Daniel as the surviving parent. The realization hit me so hard the room began to spin. Are you saying he might hurt the children too? I asked, gripping the edge of the table. I'm saying we need to move fast, Claire replied. I've already contacted Detective Alvarez at the Sheriff's Department. They're preparing arrest warrants for both Daniel and Vanessa, but it'll take a day or two to coordinate everything with the medical examiner and the insurance fraud division. A day or two. The words echoed like a countdown clock. That might be too long, I said quietly, picturing Evan's small hand slipping my phone number into his backpack, and Lucas's guarded, intelligent eyes already suspecting that something wasn't right about his father. I agree, Claire said. Which is why I'm recommending you take immediate action to protect the boys. Do you have any legal standing to request emergency custody? I thought about Daniel's neglect, his absence from the funeral, his decision to move the children into a stranger's home, but there wasn't enough written documentation to convince a court. Probably not, I admitted. Then we need to be creative, she said. When's the next time you'll know where the boys will be? Someplace public, where Daniel can be separated from them without causing a scene? Came to me instantly. This Saturday, I said. Evan's Little League team has the championship game at Oak Ridge Park. It's the last game of the season. Emily talked about it for weeks before she got too sick to go. Even Daniel wouldn't dare miss it. He's too concerned with appearances. Claire smiled faintly. Perfect. A public park, plenty of witnesses. If we time it right, Law enforcement can take him into custody safely while you keep the boys calm. As we finalized the plan, a strange feeling crept through me. Something I hadn't felt since before Emily's diagnosis. Hope, sharp and deliberate, mixed with the fierce determination that only comes when a mother decides she has nothing left to lose. Daniel Graves believed he'd committed the perfect crime, killing his wife under the guise of cancer, collecting her money, and reshaping his life with his accomplice. But he'd made one fatal miscalculation. He underestimated how far a grandmother would go to protect her grandsons. Saturday would be his undoing. That morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of bright spring day that would have made Emily smile. I dressed carefully, choosing my favorite red sweater, the one she always said made my eyes look brighter. I arrived at Oak Ridge Park 30 minutes early and claimed a seat in the bleachers where I could see both the field and the parking lot. At 10:15, Daniel's silver BMW rolled in. He stepped out, looking every bit the devoted father, with the boys trailing behind and Vanessa Cole by his side. It was the first time I'd seen her in person. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps mid-30s, with salon-perfect highlights and the kind of polished beauty that money can buy. She wore jeans and a team t-shirt, her every movement rehearsed to perfection, like she'd been practicing how to look maternal in the mirror. Evan spotted me almost immediately and lifted his arm to wave, but Daniel caught his wrist and said something sharp. I couldn't hear the words from 20 feet away, but I didn't need to. The way Evan's shoulders slumped and his eyes dropped to the ground said everything. Vanessa leaned in and whispered something to him. He nodded reluctantly, then she straightened and scanned the crowd. Her gaze found mine. She smiled, waving like we were old friends, but her eyes carried a warning. The game began. Evan's team fell behind early. He struck out in the first inning, his mind clearly elsewhere. From the sidelines, Daniel shouted cheerful encouragements, his voice bright for the crowd's benefit. But even from where I sat, I could see him constantly glancing at his phone, scanning the entrances like a man waiting for something, or someone. In the third inning, my phone vibrated with the message I'd been waiting for. Units in position. Give us 5 minutes, then move toward the concession stand. I rose, collected my purse, and walked calmly toward the food truck. My heart was pounding, but my steps stayed measured. Behind me, I heard Vanessa tell Daniel she was going to get drinks for the boys. Moments later, she appeared beside me in line, her expression polite and bright. "You must be Linda," she said warmly. "I'm Vanessa. I've heard so much about you." I turned to face her, the woman who'd helped poison my daughter, who'd smiled through Emily's funeral, who now pretended to be family. "Have you?" I asked coolly. "Oh yes," she said with a gentle laugh. "Daniel talks about you all the time. He says you've been so supportive during this difficult transition." "Supportive transition?" I echoed softly. "Yes, it's been difficult, losing Emily so suddenly." I paused just long enough to meet her gaze. So unexpectedly. Something flickered in her eyes, but she kept her mask on. "Cancer is terrible. So unpredictable." "Yes," I said, my voice low. "Almost like being poisoned." Her smile faltered for half a second, just long enough for me to know I'd hit a nerve. "I'm sorry," she said. "Oleander extract," I continued, almost conversationally. "Fascinating plant. Beautiful flowers. Deadly when prepared correctly. It causes symptoms nearly identical to advanced cancer. Did you know that?" Her hand tightened on her purse strap. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," I said. "The insurance policy adjustments, the medication management, the perfectly timed decline. Very meticulous work. You must have been quite the professional partner." Vanessa's gaze darted around the crowd, probably searching for Daniel, or for an exit. "You're upset," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've been through a terrible loss. You're not thinking clearly." I smiled. "Actually, I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months. Clear enough to hire a private investigator. Clear enough to request a second toxicology test. Clear enough to contact the sheriff's department and the insurance fraud division." Her face drained of color. You can't prove anything." "Can't I?" I said. "Because Detective Alvarez seems to think otherwise. In fact, he should be having a very interesting conversation with Daniel right about now." As if on cue, shouts erupted from the bleachers. Daniel's voice rising above the others, demanding to know what was happening. Vanessa spun toward the commotion, her expression collapsing from confidence into sheer panic. I saw the instant she realized that their carefully built empire of lies was crumbling around her. "The boys!" she gasped suddenly, turning back to me. "Where are the boys?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Safe," I said softly. "Which is more than I can say for you and Daniel." She ran. Vanessa made it exactly 37 steps before Detective Alvarez's partner tackled her to the ground near third base. Her fake designer purse flew open, scattering its contents across the infield like the pieces of a life built on deceit. And just like that, the nightmare that had consumed my family for months was finally over, or at least beginning to end. Among the spilled contents of Vanessa's fake designer purse, lipstick, keys, receipts, something glinted under the sunlight. A small glass vial filled with clear liquid and a capped syringe lay in the dirt for everyone to see. The game stopped entirely. Parents froze, children whispered, and a murmur rippled through the stands as two more uniformed officers moved in to escort Daniel Graves from the bleachers. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his voice rising in indignant protest. "I have rights. You can't do this. I want my lawyer," he shouted. But without his boardroom authority and rehearsed composure, he no longer sounded powerful. He sounded like what he truly was, a desperate man watching the empire he'd built on lies begin to collapse. Near the dugout, Lucas and Evan stood frozen, confusion and fear carved into their young faces as the world they knew unraveled around them. I pushed through the crowd, my steps steady even as the scene buzzed with tension. "Grandma?" Evan's voice was small, trembling. "What's happening to Dad and Vanessa?" I knelt down in front of both boys and took their hands. Around us, officers worked quietly, preserving evidence and ushering spectators away. Detective Alvarez caught my eye from across the field and gave a subtle nod. Everything was unfolding just as planned. "Your father and Vanessa have been arrested," I said gently. "They did some very bad things, and now they have to face the consequences." "What kind of bad things?" Lucas asked, his 13-year-old mind already putting the puzzle pieces together, connecting every strange moment he'd noticed but hadn't been able to name. I looked at my grandsons, two brave, broken boys who had already lost their mother, and were now learning that their father was responsible for it. How do you explain that kind of betrayal to children who still believed good always triumphed, that parents protected, that love was safe? "They hurt your mom," I said softly. "They made her sicker when she could have gotten better." Evan began to cry, deep, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond his small frame. Lucas stood perfectly still, his jaw tightening, his expression shifting from disbelief to fury to comprehension. "Did Dad kill Mom?" he asked finally. I could have deflected. I could have promised to explain later when they were older. But they had already been lied to enough. They deserved the truth. "Yes," I said quietly. "He did." Lucas's eyes filled, but he didn't cry. He just nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already feared but hadn't wanted to believe. "What happens to us now?" he asked. Before I could answer, Detective Alvarez approached. His voice was calm, almost tender. "Your grandmother has been granted emergency custody," he told them. "You'll stay with her while we sort everything else out." "For how long?" Evan asked through his tears. I thought of what lay ahead, the investigations, the trials, the sentencing. The life insurance money that would now go toward the boys' education instead of funding Daniel and Vanessa's escape. The empty bedrooms in my home that had been waiting far too long to be filled again. "For as long as you want," I said, squeezing their hands. "This is your home now." We walked together toward my car, away from the field, the flashing lights, and the shattered illusion of Daniel Graves' perfect life. Evan slipped his small hand into mine, while Lucas walked on the other side, his shoulders squared, already carrying the quiet strength of someone who had grown up too fast. Behind us, Vanessa was screaming at the officers about immunity deals and cooperation agreements, desperate to save herself by betraying the man she had helped destroy. Even in custody, their partnership was crumbling into the same selfishness that had defined every choice they'd ever made. But I didn't look back. My focus was on my grandsons and on Emily, on justice finally being served, on the knowledge that her boys would grow up safe, loved, and free from the rot their father had brought into their lives. And most of all, I thought about that first text message, the one Daniel had sent me bragging about his millions and the will reading. Because now, sitting behind bars, he was finally learning what true loss meant. Sometimes the biggest mistake a man can make is underestimating a grandmother's love. Daniel Graves was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 6 months after Emily's funeral. Vanessa Cole received 25 years to life after her cooperation deal collapsed when prosecutors discovered she'd been the true architect behind the murder plot. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, Lucas and Evan beside me, watching the man who had once called me Mom, for 7 years stand before the judge as a convicted murderer. He looked older, his hair graying, his posture slumped. Gone was the charm, the polished arrogance. What remained was the hollow shell of a man who had destroyed everything he touched. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Daniel turned toward us. For a fleeting moment I thought he might apologize, acknowledge what he'd done to Emily, to the boys, to all of us. Instead, he said, "I want my sons to know that everything I did was for their financial future." The courtroom fell silent. Then Lucas stood. My brave 13-year-old grandson, now nearly 14, lifted his chin and spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the room. "We don't want your blood money," he said. "We want our mom back." The judge had to call for order as the room erupted, gasps, muffled sobs, the sound of Daniel's remaining relatives realizing at last who and what he truly was. Justice had been served. And though nothing could bring Emily back, her sons would grow up knowing that their grandmother never stopped fighting for them. Or for her. Evan stayed seated beside me, but I felt his small hand tighten around mine. A quiet, unspoken show of strength that echoed his brother's words across the silent courtroom. That afternoon, we drove to visit Emily's grave for the first time since the arrests. I had been waiting for this moment, waiting until we could go together as a family. No more secrets, no more lies, only truth and justice. The boys brought drawings they'd made during art therapy, colorful reminders of hope taking root again. I carried a bouquet of yellow roses, the same kind I used to bring to their grandfather's resting place when the boys were little. As we arranged the flowers around the polished headstone, Evan looked up at me, his voice soft. "Do you think she knows? About Dad going to jail and everything?" I traced my fingers over Emily's name etched into the granite, the cold stone marking the beginning and end of a life that should have been twice as long. "I think she knows we fought for her," I said. "And I think she knows you boys are safe now." That evening, as I helped Evan with his homework while Lucas practiced guitar in the living room, the house felt alive again. The quiet that had once haunted every corner was gone, replaced by the warm, chaotic sounds of pencils scratching, chords being tuned, and laughter sneaking back into our routines. Then my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of the insurance company that had been delaying the life insurance payout for months. "Mrs. Graves," said a calm, professional voice. "This is Aaron Price from Evertrust Life Insurance. I'm calling to inform you that the policy payout has been approved. The funds will be transferred to the beneficiary trust within 72 hours. $2 million. Money that Daniel had intended to steal, now secured in trust for Emily's sons until they reached 18. It would pay for their education, their futures, the dreams their mother had once whispered about when life still seemed endless." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen taking in the sounds around me. The clatter of dishes, the buzz of video games, the muffled laughter from the next room. For years this house had been too quiet, a shrine of memories and grief. Now it was full again, messy, loud, alive. The beautiful noise of a family rebuilding itself after devastation. My phone buzzed again. For a split second my heart skipped as old fears resurfaced. The echo of that first text message from Daniel, the one about millions and will readings. But when I looked, the sender was Lucas. "Thanks for everything, Grandma. Love you." I stared at the message for a long moment, a lump rising in my throat. In those few simple words, every ounce of pain and healing, loss and love seemed to collide. Emily was gone, nothing could change that, but her boys were safe. Her murderer was behind bars. And in the fragile space between heartbreak and hope, we were learning how to be a family again. Daniel Graves had thought himself untouchable, a mastermind orchestrating the perfect crime and a future built on lies. But he'd made one fatal mistake. He'd underestimated a grandmother with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Justice, I realized, isn't always served in courtrooms. Sometimes it's delivered by the steady hands of someone who refuses to stop until the truth is seen. The boys were home. The truth had prevailed. And somehow, against every cruel twist of fate, we were going to be okay. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you have a story to tell, share it in the comments. Your voice matters.